The impact of the fall knocked the air out of me. The ground was damp, the grass soft, but the sharp pain in my ankle told me I hadn't escaped unscathed. Jake was on the ground beside me, clutching his shoulder like he had dislocated it. Sarah was gasping, trying to get up, and Chris groaned, holding his leg. There was no time to assess the damage. I looked up. The shattered glass from the balcony reflected the house's light, but what made my stomach twist was the sight of multiple heads peering down at us, motionless, just watching. Their dark, empty eyes were visible even from this distance. No words, no sound. They just stood there observing. "Run," Jake managed to say, yanking Sarah by the arm. Without thinking, I did the same. We sprinted across the perfect lawn, our steps uneven from pain and fear. The front gate was too far, but there was a short fence at the back, near a dark wooded area. It was the fastest way out. My chest burned, my vision wobbled with each stride, but nothing mattered except getting away. As we reached the fence, Chris grabbed one of the garden chairs and threw it against it, making it easier to climb. Jake went first, Sarah right behind. When I pulled myself up, I heard a sound behind us. Not footsteps, not voices, just the dry, deliberate creak of the house's front door opening. I didn't dare look back. I just threw myself over the fence, landing hard on the other side. Chris was right behind me, barely making it before the eerie silence was broken by a slow, synchronized movement, dozens of feet stepping onto the grass at the same time. It wasn't a chase, it was worse. They weren't running after us, they were just moving, like they knew exactly where we'd end up. The way they stepped forward, in perfect unison, sent an ice-cold panic through me. Jake grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "Don't stop," he hissed. We bolted into the trees, branches scratching against my arms as we pushed deeper into the woods. The further we ran, the darker it got. My breaths were ragged, my legs screaming in protest, but we couldn't stop, not yet. Only when the house lights were nothing but a faint glow behind us did we slow down, huddling together, trying to quiet our breathing. "Did they follow?" Sarah whispered. Chris turned, peering through the trees. Silence. Then, slowly, his face drained of color. "They're not following," he muttered. "They're waiting." A shiver ran down my spine. "What do you mean, waiting?" I asked, but I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Chris didn't say anything, he just pointed. Through the trees, barely visible in the dim moonlight, they stood at the edge of the woods. Lined up, perfectly still, facing us. Not a single one of them moved. No shifting weight, no nervous glances, just rigid, unnatural silence. My throat went dry. They weren't hunting us, they were letting us run, letting us think we had a chance. Jake clenched his fists.
"Screw this," he muttered, turning toward the deeper part of the forest.
We keep moving. No one argued. We didn't know where we were going, but staying here wasn't an option. We stumbled through the undergrowth, our pace slower now, exhaustion creeping in. My ankle throbbed with every step, but I pushed forward. The air felt heavier, charged, like a storm was about to break. Then Sarah gasped, grabbing my wrist. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all stopped, listening. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no, it was that same low hum from inside the house. Except now, it was coming from all around us. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground, through my ribs, through my skull. It wasn't just a sound, it was something deeper, something wrong. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. Chris stumbled, gripping a tree for support. Sarah let out a strangled whimper, shaking her head like she was trying to shake it out of her brain. "We have to keep moving," Jake gritted out, his voice strained, like it hurt just to speak. But where? The deeper we went, the more the forest felt unreal. The trees seemed too evenly spaced, the darkness too thick, the air too still. Like we had stepped into something that wasn't really a forest at all. Then I noticed the shadows. Not our own, something else. They stretched along the ground in the wrong direction, shifting unnaturally, as if cast by a light that wasn't there. "Look," I whispered, pointing. Sarah followed my gaze and choked back a scream. The shadows weren't attached to anything. They were just moving on their own, sliding between the trees, circling us. The hum grew sharper, almost a ringing now, and I felt something warm trickle down from my nose. Blood. My vision blurred for a second, and in that moment, I saw them. Not the guests. Something else. Dark figures standing in the spaces between the trees, barely visible, watching, waiting. My stomach clenched so hard, I thought I was going to be sick. The figures between the trees weren't moving, but I could feel them pressing in, like they were closing an invisible net around us. My legs locked up. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where? There was no safe direction. The guests were still standing at the tree line. The forest itself felt warped, and those things, whatever they were getting closer. Jake grabbed my arm, snapping me out of it. "Go, now," he rasped. His nose was bleeding too. So was Sarah's. Chris wiped at his own face, cursing under his breath. That sound, that awful hum, was doing something to us. We ran blindly, deeper into the trees, dodging roots and low branches. My lungs burned, my ankles screamed, but I didn't dare slow down. The ground beneath us felt wrong, too soft, like we were running on something that wasn't entirely solid. I glanced down just once and saw my foot sink slightly, as if the earth had briefly swallowed it before spitting it back out. My breath hitched. "Don't look down," Sarah yelped, as if she knew exactly what I had seen. We kept running, panic overriding pain, until suddenly there was nothing beneath us. We fell, not far, but enough to send us tumbling into what felt like a ditch or a pit. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a second, everything spun. The hum, God, that hum was still there, drilling into my skull, vibrating in my teeth. Sarah groaned beside me, struggling to sit up. Chris was coughing, gripping his ribs. Jake was the first to react, scrambling to his feet. "We have to climb out," he gasped. But as he reached for the dirt wall, he froze. "No, no, no." His voice barely came out, and when I followed his gaze, my blood turned to ice. The dirt around us wasn't just dirt. It was covered in something, not something, names. Hundreds of them, scratched into the walls, overlapping, fading, rewritten. I traced my fingers over one. The letters were rough, dug deep, like they had been carved by desperate hands. Some were familiar, too familiar. Sarah sucked in a breath. "These are," she didn't finish because we all saw it at the same time. Near the bottom of the wall, half buried in the dirt, were 4 fresh names. Our names. The last letter of mine had just been carved, as if the earth itself had written it while we stood there. My entire body went cold. I reached out, barely daring to touch the letters. The dirt crumbled slightly beneath my fingers, fresh, like it had just been carved moments ago. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head violently. No, this isn't real." But it was. Our names were here, buried among countless others, and I didn't want to think about what that meant. Chris staggered back, his breath coming in quick, sharp gasps. "We have to get out of here, now." Jake turned and dug his hands into the dirt wall, trying to climb. But the moment he pulled himself up, the ground shifted, not like normal soil, not like loose dirt. It moved on its own, swallowing his grip, forcing him back down. He let out a strangled yelp, stumbling back. "What the hell?" He tried again, same result. The walls weren't letting us out. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. We were trapped. That hum, it wasn't just a sound. It was something else, something alive. And it wanted us here. Panic surged through me, making my limbs feel useless. Sarah was scratching at the dirt, trying to dig her way out. But it was pointless. The ground swallowed every movement, pulling back into place like we had never even touched it. Chris slammed his fists against the wall, his breathing erratic. "This isn't happening," he kept muttering, like saying it would make it true. But it was happening. The hum wasn't just inside my head anymore. It was in my chest, under my skin, inside my bones. Then the shadows moved. Not ours, theirs. The ones that had been slithering between the trees. They stretched down into the pit, creeping toward us, curling unnaturally along the walls. And then they started to rise. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows weren't just shapes, they were figures, pulling themselves up from the dirt, shifting into something almost human but wrong, too tall, too thin, limbs bending at angles that made my stomach churn. Their heads tilted in unison, just like the guests at the party. The hum reached a deafening pitch. Something was coming. The air around us grew thick, like we were sinking into something invisible. My ears popped, my vision blurred, and the hum turned into a deep, guttural vibration that rattled inside my skull. The shadow figures kept rising, their bodies forming from the darkness itself, but there were no faces, no eyes, just empty, stretching voids where their features should be. One of them took a step forward, its foot not touching the ground, just hovering slightly above it. Sarah let out a sharp, panicked sob. "We have to move," she gasped, grabbing at my arm. But where? There was nowhere to go. The walls wouldn't let us climb. The figures were closing in, and that feeling, the crushing, suffocating feeling that we had stepped into something we were never meant to see, was getting worse. Then I noticed something. Among the scratch names on the wall, some weren't crossed out. Most were, but not all. My brain latched onto that single, desperate detail. Someone, at some point, had gotten out. My fingers dug into the wall, tracing over the uncrossed names. They were fewer, almost lost among the ones that had been scratched out, but they were there. Someone had made it, somehow. "Look," I choked out, pointing. Jake's eyes widened as he realized what I meant. Then he didn't get to finish. The shadows surged forward. One of them reached for Chris. Its arms stretched unnaturally long, its fingers tapering into needle-thin points. He barely dodged, stumbling back into Sarah. "We need to do something," she screamed. The hum was inside me now, inside all of us, twisting our thoughts, pressing down on our chests like it wanted to pull us under. My head spun. Think, how did the others get out? I looked again at the names. And then, beneath one of them, faint but still visible, I saw something scratched into the dirt. A word. Give. Give. The word stared back at me, carved deep into the dirt like a desperate warning or an instruction. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Give what? My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The shadows moved closer, their arms stretching, fingers twitching like they were waiting. Sarah was shaking beside me, gripping my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin. Chris was backing up, his wide eyes darting between the walls, the figures, and the shifting ground beneath us. Then Jake did something reckless. He spoke to them. "What do you want?" His voice wavered, but he didn't back down. The shadows paused. Just for a second. The hum didn't stop, but it shifted, almost like it was listening. My heart pounded as I looked at the word again. Give. Was that what the others had done? Was that how they got out? But what did it mean? A sacrifice? An offering? My stomach twisted. Whatever it was, we were running out of time. The shadows leaned in, their featureless faces so close now, the air around us buzzing with something I couldn't understand. Jake's words hung in the air, swallowed by the hum. The shadows didn't speak, didn't react, not in any way that made sense, but something about their stillness felt like an answer. They were waiting. I turned to the word again. Give. My stomach twisted. "I think we have to give them something," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Sarah's eyes snapped to mine, wild with panic. "Give them what?" she demanded. "We don't have anything." But that wasn't true. We had ourselves. A sick realization settled in my gut. Was that the choice? Was that why some names weren't crossed out because someone had stayed behind? My throat tightened. "No," Chris said before I could even speak. He must have seen the thought forming in my face. No way in hell. But behind him, the shadows shifted, almost like they understood. Like they knew we knew. The hum grew deeper, vibrating through the dirt, through our bones. I could feel it pulling at us, pulling at me, like it was trying to decide if we were worthy of leaving. The realization hit us all at once. One of us had to stay. That was the price. That's why some names weren't crossed out, because someone had given themselves to whatever this was. My chest tightened, my mind screaming for another way out, but there wasn't one. The walls wouldn't let us climb. The shadows wouldn't let us run. The hum was pressing into my skull, my ribs, my very thoughts, demanding an answer. Sarah was shaking her head violently, whispering "no, no, no" over and over. Chris clenched his fists, his body tense like he was ready to fight something he couldn't even touch. Jake looked between us, his breathing unsteady. "We can't," he started, but then he stopped. His face changed. He understood. His gaze flickered to the shadows, then back to us. "Go," he said. My stomach dropped. "No," I said immediately, stepping toward him. "Jake, no." But he just shook his head, forcing a tight, uneven smile. "It's me or all of us." "No," I choked out, grabbing Jake's arm. "We'll find another way." But deep down, I knew there wasn't another way. He knew it too. The shadows had stopped advancing, just waiting, as if they already knew what was coming. The hum vibrated through my skull, through my ribs, settling into something that almost felt like approval. Jake exhaled sharply, like he'd already made peace with it. "Go," he repeated, firmer this time. Chris looked like he wanted to fight him, to drag him out if he had to, but Jake stepped back toward them. The moment he did, the air changed. The crushing weight, the suffocating pressure, it lifted. The dirt wall behind us cracked, splitting open just enough for the rest of us to escape. That was the deal. The hum swelled, almost deafening now, and the shadows moved around Jake, circling him, their bodies stretching taller, thinner, claiming him. I wanted to pull him back. I wanted to fight. But his eyes met mine one last time, and I saw it. Acceptance. He nodded just once. So we ran. We didn't look back. Couldn't. The second we stumbled through the opening in the dirt wall, it sealed shut behind us with a sickening, grinding sound like the earth itself was swallowing the space whole. The hum cut off abruptly, leaving behind a deafening silence. It was like the pit, the shadows. Jake, none of it had ever been there. But we knew better. Our bodies were shaking, adrenaline and terror making it hard to move, but we forced ourselves forward. The trees around us felt different now, less unnatural, more like a real forest again. The air was thin, no longer pressing down on our lungs. The sky above us was just dark, normal, like it should have been all along. The house was nowhere in sight. No shadows, no figures, no guests, and standing still at the edge of the trees, just emptiness. Jake was gone. Chris collapsed to his knees, his hands buried in his hair. Sarah was sobbing, barely able to breathe. My whole body was numb, my mind refusing to process it. We had left him there. We had left him. And the worst part? That was the only reason we got out. We didn't speak. Not as we stumbled through the trees, not as we reached the road, not even when we saw the first flickering streetlights in the distance. It felt wrong, impossible, that the world was still moving, that cars were still passing by, that the night hadn't swallowed everything like it had swallowed Jake, but we had made it. Somehow we had made it. Chris flagged down a car, and a middle-aged couple stopped, their faces filled with concern as they rolled down the window. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my mind blank. Sarah was the one who finally choked out, "Please, just take us anywhere." The woman in the passenger seat nodded quickly, unlocking the doors. We piled in, shaking, silent, numb. As the car pulled away, I stared out the window, watching the trees fade into the distance, and that's when I saw it. For just a second, between the gaps in the trees, a figure was standing there. Not a shadow, not one of those things. Jake. His body was still, his face unreadable. But his head was tilted just slightly, watching,